27 moments Johnny Carson hated most on The Tonight Show, the uncomfortable guest encounters. For 30 years Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late-night television. With his quick wit, charming smile, and impeccable timing, he invited America into their living rooms each evening. But behind that polished exterior and seemingly effortless banter lurked moments that made even the unflappable Carson cringe, squirm, and occasionally lose his legendary cool. Today we're pulling back the curtain on the moments Johnny Carson hated most during his 3-decade reign on The Tonight Show. From guests who went too far to animal encounters gone terribly wrong. From awkward confrontations to moments where his carefully crafted persona cracked completely open. These aren't just uncomfortable television moments. They're revealing glimpses into the real man behind the desk that NBC executives never wanted you to see. So sit back as we expose the rarely discussed dark side of late-night television's golden era. The moments that had Johnny Carson silently fuming while keeping that famous smile plastered on his face. Because in show business, the most revealing truths often emerge when things don't go according to plan. When you hosted the same show for 30 years with thousands of celebrity guests, uncomfortable moments were inevitable. But certain encounters stood out as particularly painful for Carson, moments where his famous charm was tested to its absolute limits. Bob Hope's endless self-promotion. Johnny Carson's most frequent guest was comedy legend Bob Hope, who appeared on The Tonight Show more than any other celebrity. But what viewers at home didn't realize was that Carson secretly dreaded these appearances. While Hope was undeniably an American icon, by the 1970s and 80s, his Tonight Show appearances had become predictable and painfully scripted. Hope would walk on, deliver pre-written jokes regardless of Carson's questions, promote his latest NBC special with a clip, and then exit, all without any genuine interaction. For Carson, a master of spontaneous wit, these robotic appearances were the antithesis of good television. Behind the scenes, when producers would inform Carson that Hope wanted to come on the show again, Johnny would visibly deflate, asking, "Again?" But he never felt he could refuse the network's biggest star. What made these appearances particularly uncomfortable was Hope's declining abilities in his later years. As his eyesight and hearing failed, Hope would often answer questions out of order or miss Carson's cues entirely. According to Tonight Show producer Peter Lasley, after one particularly awkward appearance, Carson commented that he hoped someone would shoot him if he ever ended up like that. Chevy Chase's hostile interview. In 1986, comedian Chevy Chase appeared on The Tonight Show to promote his movie Three Amigos. What should have been a standard promotional interview quickly turned uncomfortable as Chase's notorious ego took center stage. From the moment he sat down, Chase projected an air of superiority, speaking over Carson and hijacking the interview. The tension became palpable when Chase began directing his answers toward the audience rather than engaging with Carson, a major late-night etiquette breach. Carson, ever the professional, maintained his composure, but viewers familiar with his mannerisms could see the telltale signs of his irritation. The tightened jaw, the forced smile, and the drumming of his pencil on the desk. Behind the scenes, after Chase left, Carson reportedly told his producer, "I don't need that kind of trouble in my life. Let him go on one of the other shows." Myrtle Young's potato chips prank gone wrong. Not all uncomfortable moments were the fault of difficult celebrities. Sometimes Carson's own practical jokes backfired spectacularly. In 1987, an elderly woman named Myrtle Young appeared on the show to display her collection of potato chips that resembled famous figures. After showing several examples, Carson asked her to step away momentarily while they prepared for the next segment. While her back was turned, Carson reached below his desk, pulled out a regular potato chip, and took a loud crunching bite. Myrtle spun around in horror, thinking he had eaten one of her prized collectibles, and nearly collapsed on set. Her genuine distress was so severe that Carson immediately regretted the prank. As documented in the book Johnny Carson by his longtime lawyer Henry Bushkin, Carson later expressed regret about this moment to his staff, saying it was a mean-spirited thing to do to a sweet lady. The look of instant remorse on his face was unmistakable as he quickly comforted Myrtle, explaining it was just a regular chip. This incident bothered Carson for years afterward. According to Tonight Show writer Andrew Nichols in a 2012 PBS interview, Carson occasionally referenced it as an example of a joke he wished he could take back. A rare admission for a host who rarely acknowledged missteps. Milton Berle taking over the show. Television pioneer Milton Berle, known as Uncle Milty to generations of viewers, appeared on The Tonight Show in 1965. What followed was a textbook example of an old-school performer refusing to cede the spotlight. Berle, a product of vaudeville and early television where performers fought for every second of camera time, essentially hijacked the show. He interrupted Carson repeatedly, told long-winded stories without allowing Carson to interject, and even started directing the band and cameras himself. For Carson, who prided himself on maintaining control of his program, Berle's domineering behavior was insufferable. Though he maintained his composure on air, backstage Carson exploded, telling his producer never to book Berle without explicit instructions about respecting the show's format. This incident contributed to Carson's notorious gatekeeping, of which comedians would be invited to sit on the couch after their performances, a coveted honor that he would withhold from performers who didn't respect his boundaries. Madonna's lingerie interview. In June 1987, pop star Madonna made her first ever talk show appearance on The Tonight Show. From the moment she walked onto the set wearing a black bustier as an outer garment, Carson appeared slightly thrown off his game. What made this appearance particularly uncomfortable for Carson was being forced to engage with Madonna's deliberately provocative style and comments while maintaining his image as America's most trusted television host. At one point, Madonna even noted she had chosen Carson's show for her first talk show appearance because, as she put it, "I thought you should be my first." While Carson played along with the innuendo-laden conversation, backstage he expressed frustration that the interview had veered so far from his preferred style of guest interaction. As Tonight Show writer Andrew Nichols later noted in TV Guide, Johnny preferred guests who would engage in actual conversation rather than simply perform their public persona. The Madonna appearance represented a generational and cultural clash that Carson found difficult to navigate. Forced to choose between appearing prudish or endorsing a level of sexuality he wasn't entirely comfortable presenting on his show. The animal disasters. Johnny Carson loved having animal experts and their exotic creatures on The Tonight Show. Unfortunately, these segments also produced some of his most uncomfortable moments on television. The defecating marmoset. One of Carson's earliest animal mishaps occurred in 1969 when animal handler Joan Embry brought a marmoset onto the show. The tiny primate seemed docile until Embry placed it on Carson's shoulder. Without warning, the marmoset climbed onto Carson's perfectly coiffed hair, his pride and joy, and proceeded to urinate. Carson's expression of shock and disgust was genuine as he felt the warm liquid dripping down his neck. Always quick with a joke, Carson quipped, "I've had people pee on my parade before but never on my head." But backstage, he was furious, immediately showering and having his hair professionally restyled before the show's second segment. Carson particularly hated this moment because it undermined the dignified, in-control persona he worked so hard to maintain. After this incident, animal handlers were given strict instructions about what could and couldn't happen with their animals on set. The Black Panther lunge. In 1975, animal trainer Ron Shannon brought a supposedly tame Black Panther onto The Tonight Show. Carson, attempting to appear brave, approached the big cat's cage during a commercial break to get a closer look. Without warning, the panther lunged at the cage bars, swiping at Carson's face with its paw. Though the cage protected him, Carson was so startled that he visibly jumped backward and fell onto the studio floor. The audience howled with laughter as a shaken Carson returned to his desk, attempting to play off his genuine fear. The show's director caught Carson's fall on camera, and the clip was replayed endlessly on blooper reels, much to Carson's embarrassment. According to Carson's longtime producer Fred DeCordova, interviewed for the book King of the Night by Lawrence Leamer, Carson was particularly bothered about this incident becoming part of blooper specials because it contradicted his carefully maintained image of cool composure. What truly irritated Carson wasn't just the scare itself, it was becoming the butt of the joke on his own show, something he worked diligently to avoid. The elephant's accident. In 1977, Carson welcomed an animal trainer who brought a baby elephant onto the set. Though initially charmed by the creature, things took a disastrous turn when the elephant became nervous under the bright studio lights. The elephant proceeded to defecate on the studio floor, extensively. As the pile grew and the studio audience roared with laughter, Carson's disgust became increasingly apparent. The smell quickly permeated the studio, and Carson had to move his desk to continue the show. What made this moment particularly frustrating for Carson was that the incident dragged on for what felt like an eternity, as stagehands scrambled ineffectively to clean up the mess while cameras continued rolling. Carson later implemented a strict policy about larger animals on the show, requiring protective floor coverings and immediate access to cleanup crews. The uncooperative chimpanzee. In 1979, animal trainer Tina Jeter brought a supposedly well-trained chimpanzee named Mr. Jiggs onto the show. The segment started pleasantly enough, with the chimp performing simple tricks and charming the audience. Things deteriorated when Carson attempted to interact with Mr. Jiggs personally. The chimp refused to follow Carson's cues, instead wandering around the set, pulling at cables, and ultimately climbing up onto the lighting rig above the studio, refusing to come down. The show had to cut to an unplanned commercial break while handlers coaxed the animal down. When the show returned, an irritated Carson quipped, "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I prefer working with human guests." Carson particularly hated this moment because it demonstrated the cardinal sin of television, losing control of your own show. His displeasure with the trainer was evident, and internal memos after the show indicated stricter protocols for future animal guests. The biting camel. In 1986, zoologist Jim Fowler brought a young camel to The Tonight Show. During the segment, Fowler encouraged Carson to feed the camel a carrot, assuring him that the animal was gentle. As Carson extended the carrot, the camel suddenly lunged forward, taking not just the carrot but also nipping Carson's fingers. Though not seriously injured, Carson was clearly in pain and startled by the unexpected bite. What made this moment particularly uncomfortable was Carson's visible struggle to maintain his composure while in pain. His forced smile and increasingly terse interaction with Fowler made it clear to regular viewers that he was genuinely upset by the unexpected pain. Peter Lassalle, Carson's longtime producer, mentioned in the 2012 documentary Johnny Carson, King of Late Night, that this incident led to Carson implementing a no-feeding policy for his interactions with animals on the show, leaving such activities to the professional handlers. The personal intrusions. For a man as private as Johnny Carson, nothing was more uncomfortable than moments when his personal life was unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight. The Carson Rivers professional tension. Though the major betrayal would come later, the seeds of Johnny Carson's complicated relationship with Joan Rivers were planted years earlier. Though Rivers was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show and eventually became Carson's permanent guest host on Monday nights beginning in 1983, their professional relationship had underlying tensions. Behind the scenes, Carson was increasingly uncomfortable with Rivers' growing popularity as his substitute. NBC executives had begun floating her name as a possible Carson replacement whenever retirement rumors circulated, something that didn't sit well with the protective host. During a 1985 interview, Rivers publicly stated that NBC had a list of 10 potential Tonight Show successors for Carson and that she wasn't on it. While NBC denied such a list existed, the comment highlighted the awkwardness of their professional dynamic, Rivers eager for recognition as a potential heir and Carson uncomfortable with succession planning. This professional tension would be the precursor to the much more dramatic betrayal that would rank as Carson's most hated moment in his entire career. The producer's wrap-it-up signal. In 1992, Carson experienced a devastating personal tragedy when his son Ricky died in a car accident. Upon returning to The Tonight Show after a brief absence, Carson delivered a heartfelt, impromptu tribute to his son at the end of a broadcast. As Carson began speaking about his son's love of photography and the fragility of life, his longtime producer Fred DeCordova, concerned about the show running overtime, gave Carson the wrap-it-up signal from off-camera. According to King of the Night, The Life of Johnny Carson by Lawrence Leamer, Carson was visibly furious at being rushed during such a deeply personal moment. The incident so angered him that he banned DeCordova from the studio floor for the remaining months of the show's run, a stunning rebuke to a producer who had been with him for decades. As Ed McMahon later revealed in his 1998 memoir For 60 Years I've Been Listening and You're Still Standing, this moment was particularly painful for Carson because it forced a collision between his intensely private nature and his public role during a time of deep personal grief, something the fiercely compartmentalized host struggled to navigate. Tom Snyder's divorce question. In 1979, while Tom Snyder was guest hosting The Tonight Show, he made a comment about Carson's recent divorce that crossed a line. When Carson returned and learned about Snyder's remarks, he was livid. Carson fiercely guarded his privacy, especially regarding his marriages and divorces. Crew members reported that Carson was so angry about the incident that he considered never allowing Snyder to guest host again. What Carson particularly despised about this situation was having his personal troubles discussed on his own show, the one place where he exercised complete control over his public image. After this incident, Carson implemented stricter rules about what guest hosts could and couldn't discuss. In 1975, actor Burt Reynolds appeared on The Tonight Show and engaged in what started as a playful water fight with Carson. What began as light banter escalated when Reynolds dumped an entire pitcher of water onto Carson's suit. Though Carson tried to maintain his good humor on camera, those familiar with his meticulous attention to appearance knew he was seething underneath. Carson prided himself on his immaculate wardrobe and polished appearance, and being soaked on national television was his idea of a nightmare. After the commercial break, Carson appeared in new clothes but was noticeably cooler toward Reynolds for the remainder of the interview. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly said, "That kind of juvenile stunt might work on Merv Griffin's show but not here." Not all uncomfortable moments for Carson were entirely negative. In 1965, actor Ed Ames appeared on the show to demonstrate tomahawk throwing, a skill he had learned playing a Native American character on the television show Daniel Boone. When Ames threw the tomahawk at a wooden silhouette, it landed directly in the figure's crotch. The audience erupted in sustained laughter that continued for nearly a minute. While this moment is often cited as one of the funniest spontaneous moments in television history, Carson was initially uncomfortable with how it played out on his relatively new show. The sexual nature of the joke pushed boundaries for 1960s television, and Carson was briefly concerned about network reaction. What made this moment complex for Carson was the tightrope walk between comedy gold and potential controversy, though he ultimately embraced the moment's humor with his quick quip, "I didn't even know you were Jewish." Carson was momentarily thrown by the unexpectedly risque turn of events. Some of Carson's most uncomfortable moments came when guests behaved in unpredictable or confrontational ways, challenging his control of the show. In 1976, Frank Sinatra appeared on The Tonight Show, ostensibly to promote his latest album. From the moment he walked out, however, it was clear Sinatra had his own agenda. Rather than following the usual interview format, Sinatra essentially took over the show, dictating which topics were discussed, interrupting Carson repeatedly, and even taking over as a quasi-host at points, asking Carson questions instead of answering them. For Carson, who prided himself on controlling the pace and direction of his show, Sinatra's domineering presence was deeply uncomfortable. Though Carson maintained his professional demeanor, viewers familiar with his subtle cues could see his growing irritation in his tightened smile and forced laughter. What made the situation particularly difficult was Sinatra's stature in the entertainment world. Unlike with lesser-known guests, Carson couldn't assert his authority without risking a significant backlash. He was forced to surrender control of his own show temporarily, something he deeply resented. Carson biographer Lawrence Leamer notes in King of the Night that this interview represented a rare instance of Carson being truly intimidated by a guest, something that bothered him immensely when he reviewed the show later. According to longtime NBC executive Dick Ebersol, interviewed for the Television Academy, Carson later complained, "I felt like I was a guest on my own damn show." Actor Charles Grodin developed a unique shtick for his Tonight Show appearances in the early 1990s, directly confronting and criticizing Carson himself. While partly an act, Grodin pushed boundaries in ways that visibly discomforted the host. During one infamous appearance, Grodin questioned Carson's interviewing skills, saying, "You don't seem prepared for this interview. Did you even read my book?" Carson, caught off guard, struggled to maintain his composure as Grodin continued his critique. Though Carson eventually adapted to Grodin's confrontational style, establishing a love-hate on-screen relationship that viewers enjoyed, these appearances always pushed Carson outside his comfort zone. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly said that Grodin's appearances aged him in dog years. What Carson particularly disliked about these moments was having his professionalism questioned on his own show, forcing him to defend himself rather than maintain his carefully crafted position as the one asking the questions. In 1987, during a typical monologue, Carson lightly tapped his pencil on his desk while making a joke about poorly maintained movie theaters. To everyone's surprise, especially Carson's, the entire desktop suddenly broke and collapsed. While the audience roared with laughter, Carson was momentarily mortified. The desk was his command center, a symbol of his authority on the show, and seeing it literally fall apart on air represented a loss of control. After a moment of genuine shock, Carson's quick wit took over as he quipped, "I broke my desk." Horowitz never had this problem. He continued the show standing up while stagehands scrambled to repair the furniture. Though this moment became a beloved blooper, Carson was initially uncomfortable with the disruption to his meticulously run show. The incident particularly bothered him because it highlighted the aging, increasingly rickety nature of his set, something NBC had been slow to update despite the show's enormous profitability. In December 1973, Carson made a joke in his monologue about a supposed shortage of toilet paper. "You know, we've got all sorts of shortages these days," he said. "But have you heard the latest? I'm not kidding, I saw it in the papers. There's an acute shortage of toilet paper." What Carson didn't anticipate was that viewers would take his joke seriously. The next day, panicked consumers began clearing store shelves of toilet paper, creating an actual shortage that lasted for weeks. The Tonight Show had inadvertently caused a nationwide panic. Carson was mortified by the real-world impact of his joke and issued a clarification and apology on air. "I don't want to be remembered as the man who created a false toilet paper scare," he said. "There is no shortage except for the one I caused." What Carson hated about this incident was the unintended consequences of his comedy. He prided himself on understanding the power of television but had underestimated just how much influence his words carried with the American public. In 1973, self-proclaimed psychic Uri Geller appeared on The Tonight Show promising to demonstrate his supernatural abilities. What Geller didn't know was that Carson, a skilled amateur magician himself, had consulted with professional magician and skeptic James Randi before the show. On Randi's advice, Carson's team prepared their own props for Geller's demonstrations rather than allowing him to use his own specially prepared items. When presented with these unfamiliar props, Geller faltered completely. Despite multiple attempts, Geller failed to bend spoons, identify hidden drawings, or make a compass move, all feats he had successfully performed on other shows. As Geller made increasingly desperate excuses, Carson's skepticism became more apparent. What made this moment particularly significant, and what Carson secretly loved despite his uncomfortable position, was that he had deliberately set up Geller to fail. Carson deeply resented charlatans who claimed supernatural powers, and this was his calculated attempt to expose what he viewed as a fraud. The result was tremendously uncomfortable television as Geller squirmed, making excuses about not feeling strong that day. Carson maintained a facade of polite interest while subtly making it clear to viewers that they were witnessing an exposed con man. What was shocking about this incident wasn't just the on-air exposure of Geller's tricks, but what happened afterward. Despite his humiliation on The Tonight Show, Geller's career paradoxically flourished. Geller himself later admitted that Johnny Carson's show made Uri Geller. The public interpreted his failure as proof of authenticity. After all, if he were merely performing tricks, they would work every time. This outcome deeply frustrated Carson, who had hoped to end Geller's career as a psychic but instead had inadvertently enhanced it. The entire incident represented a rare instance where Carson had allowed his personal views to influence the show's content, something he generally avoided, only to see his plan backfire spectacularly. Comedian Charlie Collis had been a frequent guest on The Tonight Show throughout the 1970s, known for his zany sound effects and physical comedy. During a 1982 appearance, however, Collis made a crucial mistake that earned Carson's ire. When one of Collis's jokes fell flat, Carson playfully indicated the failure with a bomb-dropping whistle sound. In response, Collis shoved Carson, a physical boundary crossing that the host did not appreciate. Carson's reaction was swift and severe. "Don't ever do that to me again," he said coldly before moving on. According to widespread reports, after the show Carson told his producers that Collis would never appear on The Tonight Show again, and he never did. What Carson particularly hated about this moment was the physical invasion of his space and the disruption of the professional boundaries he maintained with guests. While Carson enjoyed playful banter, physical horseplay was a line he did not want crossed, especially on camera. In 1976, during one of comedian Don Rickles' appearances on The Tonight Show, Rickles accidentally broke Carson's prized cigarette box, a personal item that sat on Carson's desk throughout his career. While demonstrating an anecdote, Rickles knocked over the wooden box, breaking its lid. Carson's reaction was immediate. His face tightened, and longtime viewers could see genuine irritation flash across his typically composed demeanor. Though Carson quickly recovered with humor, staffers later revealed in interviews with Carson biographer Henry Bushkin that the host was genuinely upset backstage. That cigarette box was one of Johnny's personal items he brought from home, recalled Tonight Show producer Fred DeCordova in a 1994 interview. He valued it tremendously, and though he played it off on air, he was genuinely bothered by Rickles breaking it. What Carson particularly disliked about this moment was the invasion of his personal space and property. Though he maintained professional composure on camera, the incident illustrates how Carson kept clear boundaries between his personal and public life, and how uncomfortable he became when those lines were crossed. As comedy writer David Steinberg later noted in his memoir, this incident revealed a fascinating contradiction in Carson's persona. Johnny could roll with almost any joke at his expense, but touch his stuff without permission and you'd see a flash of the real man behind the host mask. In June 1980, Charlie's Angels star Farrah Fawcett appeared on The Tonight Show in what would become one of the most uncomfortable interviews of Carson's career. From the moment she sat down, Fawcett seemed disoriented, struggling to complete thoughts and rambling through disconnected stories. As documented in King of the Night, The Life of Johnny Carson by Lawrence Leamer, Carson attempted repeatedly to steer the conversation back on track, but Fawcett continued to drift through meandering anecdotes, often losing her train of thought mid-sentence. The audience grew increasingly uncomfortable, and Carson's trademark interview rhythm completely collapsed. Behind his professional smile, Carson was clearly struggling, a rare sight for a host famous for his ability to handle any situation. According to production assistant Peter LaSalle in a 2012 PBS documentary, Carson was furious backstage. He felt the booking team had failed to properly vet her condition before the appearance. Though alcohol speculation circulated afterward, Fawcett's representatives later denied this was the cause of her behavior. What Carson found intolerable about moments like these was the complete derailment of his meticulously planned program. As a consummate professional, Carson prided himself on maintaining control, and guests who made that impossible frustrated him deeply. According to Tonight Show writer Andrew Nichols, Carson's cardinal rule was never lose control of the show, and this interview broke that rule spectacularly. In 1980, Carson made several jokes about Wayne Newton's high-pitched voice and effeminate mannerisms during his monologues. When Newton appeared as a guest in 1981, the tension was immediate and uncomfortable. Rather than promoting his latest project, Newton immediately confronted Carson about the jokes. What made the moment particularly uncomfortable was Newton's barely concealed anger as he told Carson, "I don't appreciate being made fun of. I've been a gentleman long enough." According to Carson producer Peter LaSalle, as quoted in the 2012 PBS documentary Johnny Carson, King of Late Night, the confrontation was even more heated during commercial breaks, with Newton making statements that Carson perceived as veiled threats. What Carson found intolerable about this incident was being confronted about his comedy on his own show, especially in front of a live audience. The confrontation violated Carson's cardinal rule: never air personal grievances on camera. After this incident, Newton was reportedly on Carson's do not book list for years, though they eventually reconciled. As Carson explained to his head writer Raymond Siller after the show, "You can say anything you want about me off camera, but on my stage, I'm in control. This encounter represented one of the rare times when Carson's carefully maintained composure nearly cracked on air. In 1986, Johnny Carson experienced what he considered the ultimate betrayal from someone he had personally mentored, Joan Rivers. For years, Rivers had been Carson's permanent guest host on The Tonight Show, a position of tremendous honor in the entertainment world. When Rivers secretly negotiated a deal with the fledgling Fox network to host her own competing late-night show, Carson found out through industry gossip rather than from Rivers herself. Though Rivers has consistently maintained she tried to call Carson before the news broke, Carson claimed until his death that she never did, setting up one of the most infamous feuds in television history. The night before the announcement, Rivers had appeared on The Tonight Show, warmly bantering with Carson while wearing the same dress she'd worn during her first appearance 21 years earlier, never mentioning her imminent departure to compete directly against him. When Carson discovered the truth, he was livid. Carson's rage wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. He immediately banned Rivers from NBC entirely, refusing to ever speak to her again despite her multiple attempts to reconcile. The ban was so absolute that even subsequent Tonight Show hosts maintained it out of loyalty to Carson, with Rivers not appearing on the show again until 2014, nearly a decade after Carson's death. What made this moment so painful for Carson was his deeply held value of loyalty. As a notoriously private person with few close professional relationships, Carson had viewed Rivers as part of his inner circle. Her decision to compete against him without warning triggered his infamous cold shoulder, a punishment he never relented on for the remaining 19 years of his life. When questioned about Rivers in later years, Carson would simply change the subject or give a curt no comment. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly told NBC executives, Joan who, when her name was mentioned. The depth of his hurt was evident in his complete refusal to ever acknowledge her existence again. These uncomfortable moments reveal something important about Johnny Carson that his polished nightly performances often concealed. Behind the charming host was a deeply private man who valued control, professionalism, and maintaining clear boundaries between his public and private personas. When those boundaries were crossed, whether by overzealous guests, unpredictable animals, or network interference, Carson experienced genuine discomfort. Yet it was precisely in these moments when things didn't go according to plan that viewers got rare glimpses of the real man behind the television icon. Carson's visible discomfort in these situations humanized him, making him more relatable to the millions who welcomed him into their homes each night. His ability to navigate these awkward moments, usually with grace and humor, demonstrated why he remained television's premier host for 3 decades. What's perhaps most revealing is what Carson chose to tolerate versus what he refused to accept. He could laugh off a desk collapse or an animal mishap, but he would not tolerate being physically touched without permission or having his professional judgment questioned by sponsors. These boundaries spoke to Carson's old-school values and his understanding of the unwritten rules of celebrity. He believed in maintaining a certain dignity on air, even when things went sideways, a standard that many would argue has been lost in today's more confrontational and boundary-pushing entertainment landscape. As we look back at these uncomfortable moments from The Tonight Show, we're reminded of a different era in television, one where even the awkward moments maintained a certain elegance. Carson's discomfort was rarely expressed directly but rather through subtle cues, a tightened smile, a drumming pencil, or a perfectly timed cutting remark disguised as a joke. In the end, Johnny Carson's legacy isn't just about the thousands of shows that went perfectly according to plan. It's also about these rare moments when things went off the rails and viewers got to see the human being behind the television legend. In discomfort, as in success, Carson revealed himself to be a master of his medium. And that wraps up our look at the 25 moments Johnny Carson hated most during his 30 years on The Tonight Show. What's fascinating is how Carson managed to navigate these uncomfortable situations while maintaining his status as America's most trusted television personality.